and I don't know how faculty members are rewarded financially, and we don't want to get into that into too great a depth, but there is a benefit to keeping tenure people around because of what they bring to the table long term.
Correct.
But let's play the devil's advocate and say they're not good mentors. They're not good teachers of others. And now they are just riding the rail because they have tenure.
And that's where the weakness of our tenure system is.
Right.
Because it's a collegially based system.
Right.
You know, you have to you almost have to commit a crime before somebody's going to kick you out. And in today's day and time, I'm not sure we know what a crime is.
Yeah, there's another discussion. You're right. It is it's an interesting dilemma. I mean, we reward people for the work that they've done, and we continue to reward people as long as they are contributing. And I won't use a sports analogy because there's a perfect one that I can use, except to say that at some point in time, when the contributions wane, well, they still get their office.
Yeah, and at some point, biology wins, right?
Welcome to Peter and Phil's Courageous Conversations, a podcast addressing race relations and social issues in hopes that you'll be inspired to do the same. Now, let's begin our conversation with your hosts, Dr. Peter Weinstein and Dr. Philip Nelson.
Dr. Nelson, always a pleasure to catch up with you. Thank you for spending some time with me again. We also want to thank Nationwide for spending some time with us as well. What's cooking, good looking?
Nothing much. Nothing much. What's going on in your life?
Just getting older. Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you too. Yours was last Sunday. Is that
last
correct?
Sunday, yeah. Yours is coming up on Monday. So yeah, we're like twin sons of different mothers.
That's right.
So I got a burning sensation I want to bring up with you.
Wait a minute. It sounds like you need to go to your urologist.
But we've talked about this issue with term limits in politicians. And I think in California, we do have some term limits at the legislative level. What about tenure and faculty? Because it's kind of like a term limit, isn't it?
Oh, no, it's just the opposite.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant. Should we have term limits for faculty? Yeah, it's the anti-term limit.
It's the anti-term limit. Before I express my opinion about tenure, it's important to understand the history of academia. And it's important to understand how tenure developed and evolved, because it has a lot of relevance in what's going on today. And you can't talk about tenure if you also don't include academic freedom and the concept of academic freedom and the importance of academic freedom to societal advances. So if you'll forgive me for my Bush League historical monologue, but there was a time when, particularly during the medieval days and just prior to the Renaissance, when scholars were told what to think, or at least scholars were allowed to say only certain things that were in political alignment with the king.
Sounds like Florida right now.
Yes. And if a concept or theory or discovered fact caused trouble for the reigning monarch, the individual that promoted that in a non-democratic society was likely at a minimum chastised and frequently put to death. Everybody is generally aware of Galileo's dilemma with the Catholic Church, who had influence on the monarch, when his theories began to suggest that we weren't the center of the universe, that the sun did not revolve around Earth. Now, I'm not sure if Earth was still flat then or not, but the point is that there was a lot of headwind to the theories of constellations and orbits, etc. And had it not had scientific proofs not eventually been accepted, we would have exploded a rocket day before yesterday in our attempt to go back to the moon and eventually to Mars, because we would have been basing all of our science on propaganda and self-generated dreams that don't fit physics. So at some point, the concept of protecting academic integrity became important. At some point, during or right after the Renaissance, people began to realize that some truths are just discomforting and that it is better for us to at least know the truths and deal with them rather than to make sure that we maintain status quo at any cost. Now, in order to do that, you must protect the people that are delivering the discomforting news. In order to make those kind of advances, people need to feel safe when they come up with information that was never questioned before and may seem dangerous now. In order to do that, we must be able to trust the collective conscious of our society to deal with issues like, how do you manage nuclear weapons? How do you employ nuclear fission for power? How do you handle global warming? How do you control social justice issues? All of these issues are issues that I'm sure most of us would rather not have to deal with, except that they have good and bad consequences. And once the Pandora's box is open, it's open. So academia developed in an environment that protected the academician, the scientist, the theorist, the literary artist, the painter, so that they could push the envelope, understanding that some people, that pushing the envelope causes discomfort for society. And in order to make sure that these people had the safety and freedom to push us as far as they could, we developed safeguards. First, we said, you can't kill a person just because they disagree with you. And I should say, it's not just the king that we're talking about here. Just because you don't like the way a person looks doesn't mean you get to shoot them through the door because they're at your door and you don't like them at your door. So there were certain safeguards that were developed short of tenure that says we're going to tolerate new opinions, new theories, and we're going to develop a process that will either confirm or invalidate your theory, your thoughts. We're not talking about alternative facts here. There are no facts until they're facts, and then the facts are the facts.
I mean, you started this conversation about medieval times as well. Now, wasn't there a religious component that defined a lot of what could or couldn't be said back then as well?
Just as there is now. That has never changed.
Isn't the Pope like a tenured faculty member?
No, the Pope was like the king. The Pope was the ordained emperor by God.
Yeah.
And there were times when there was a problem with the Pope and royalty because the Pope was religious royalty, if you were Catholic.
Now, of course, he has tenure.
But if the King of England was Protestant, that created a whole different issue. The Pope was still a religious authority, but not necessarily the authority.
Okay.
Those are the problems of man, even though religion is involved. Those are the problems of our perspective of God from different paradigms and how we use religion to justify our value system, and then how we use that value system to enforce our beliefs. So the point is that tenure was developed as a result of this need to develop a system of protections.
Okay.
For people who were going to delve into what we didn't know, who were going to push the envelope and push for advances and take that risk. And we began to appreciate those advances. Until we came up with germ theory, we thought diseases were caused by spirits and humors, and that they could be eliminated by incantations. If we fast forward to America, we didn't recognize the importance of a zoonotic principle until we almost lost our entire food supply due to hog cholera in the late 1700s, early 1800s. And that's when veterinarians suddenly became important, because there was nobody to stop the decimation of our food supply. And that led to our understanding that these diseases were actually passed by microorganisms we couldn't see. And that led to our understanding, to our development of germ theory and the development of antibiotics, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But imagine if you had had an American Pope that did not want to admit that their traditional views of disease was wrong. And in his fervor to protect religious precepts, they would ostracize anybody who promoted anything different. They might kill anybody who promoted anything different. Tenure was not developed as a gift, as a benefit. Tenure in academia is synonymous, well, is almost synonymous to the Second Amendment, or more importantly, the First Amendment, more appropriately, the First Amendment. But we need to understand how it came about. You and I have become fond of this statement that, no regulation was ever generated without a violation first. And the severity of the violation, I think, is sometimes underestimated and underappreciated. Tenure was nothing short of protection from death initially. It evolved into a kind of an award. No, I don't know when tenure actually took hold as the concept we hold today. But essentially, tenure is provided academicians who have a track record of discovery, who have met the collegial standards of academia, who have actually contributed something of value to the scientific world. And the determination of that value is made by your academic colleagues. There are many permutations of it, but essentially what tenure says is that if after a trial period, as an academician, you are able to show us a work ethic that leads to significant contributions to the scientific community and a value system that promises to continue that ethic once we give you tenure, then you will be awarded tenure, and we will promise that you will have a job in academia as long as you choose, provided we have the money to keep your position. And if we have to cut people for fiscal reasons, you'll be among the last to be cut. So it is a promise of perpetual employment.
When it comes to tenure at one university, it seems like there's a respect of that tenure in cases where a faculty member may want to move to another university.
You sound surprised.
Well, I'm just
the reason I say that is because you are director of a nonprofit organization.
Right.
If you applied for another nonprofit organization, I think they would show you the respect, and even if you didn't apply for the position, they would actually ask you, wait a minute, you've been a director. How come you don't want to be the director of ours? Or why aren't you applying for a director? So of course we're going to recognize tenure across academia, but it is not automatically awarded.
Right. But is and it's not defined the same way at every university.
No, it's not. So essentially, if I were to go to another university and apply for a faculty position or even an administrative position, but I want to maintain my faculty status, I would have to apply for tenure again. I don't necessarily have to go through the trial period, but my work has to be reviewed by the faculty at that institution, and they have to agree that the decision to tenure me was appropriate. They too also have to determine that the work I did when I was awarded tenure is valued by them as well. Now, I just finished putting lipstick on a pig. That's how it's supposed to work. That was the ideal. That's what we were trying to achieve. Nothing short of protection.
And this is centuries in its history.
Yes, right. Nothing short of protection for the freedom to speak. It has evolved into a benefit, a reward system. This lifelong perpetual employment is a psychological trap. The ethereal description of tenure sounds wonderful until you put a human being in the system. And anyone that has a promised job for the rest of their life tends to see it as a disincentive to work. Now, I'm not saying everybody does, but I'll let you guess on your own experiences what % of the people actually stick to that premise in order to earn that benefit until they retire or die.
Well, I guess once you're given the crown and scepter, you really don't want to give it back.
Yes, but we don't have a lot of ways to take it back.
That's the other thing.
That's why it's a disincentive. We have pretty good, rigorous rules on getting it, but once it's gotten, we've come up with processes where we review your work every 5 years or so. But once you're a member of the club, that review is almost a pat on the back.
Once you're in the Hall of Fame, it's hard to get out of the Hall of Fame.
Exactly. And this isn't just Hall of Fame. At Hall of Fame, if you're in the Hall of Fame, you don't get a check every month.
True.
Your picture is on a wall in the Hall of Fame.
Right.
There are no royalties coming to you because people keep looking at your picture.
Point.
So you started by asking me, what do I think about tenure?
Correct.
And whether I support it. And I have to tell you that I have never supported tenure, although I'm benefiting from it now. I like it now. I still don't support it. Well, let's put it this way. I support the protection that tenure provides. I have always been an ardent supporter of rolling contracts. And I guess, to use your analogy, it's my form of term limits. And I am more of a proponent that after reviewing your performance this year, if you had a great year and you've had great years for the last 3 years, and you're a young academician, and I see nothing but rosy hillsides in front of you, then I might give you a 3-year contract rather than a 1-year contract, right? That's renewable every year. And if you have a Nobel Prize winning year, I might give you a 5-year contract.
Guaranteed.
That's renewable every year, contingent on your performance. If the next year you have a little less than a Nobel Prize winning contract, I may not give you a new contract. You still got 4 years.
The end of those 4 years, if you have been subpar,
yeah,
maybe we don't give you a new contract.
Right.
So you would have to have some truly objective measures to not roll over the contract every year with some subjective components to it, so that you can say, Phil, it's not been a good year.
Yeah. And see, the beauty of the system is if you're offering multi-year contracts, then you have flexibility. I'm not kicking you out next year.
Right.
You may lose a year of tenure, of rolling tenure, because I didn't give you a new 5-year contract. But if I give you a 4-year contract, you're still okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit more like sports.
Yes.
Than academics in
Yes.
the sense that as long as you perform, we'll guarantee your contract.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? I look at some of the athletes who get a 9-year contract for doing most valuable player type work. It's an investment of the team in that player because of what they bring to the table.
And now the difference here is the nature of the work that we're talking about here, right? In sports, we've now boiled everything down to statistics, and there's an ERA and yards per carry and all that kind of stuff. And as long as your ERA is okay, then then we're going to keep doing it. As long as you're getting 10 yards a carry, I need you. When you drop down to a yard and a half a carry, then I'm looking for another halfback. Whereas in academia, if I was to use the same analogy, some of the most important advances in science occurs because of 1,000 swings and misses.
Or 10,000 if you're Edison.
Or 10,000 if you're Edison, right? And so that's where the tension comes in. What are you measuring here? Are you measuring how many times I connect, or are you measuring how many times I swing? Are you measuring how I swing, or are you measuring whether I swing? Elon Musk just blew up $1 million rocket and was happy with it because of the data he got from that explosion or before the explosion that will help him set up the next test. That's the challenge administrators have in academia, right? In order to be fair. So when we look at the legislators across the country who are not educators, by the way, that's why they have a different name. When I see them interfering with academia, as if they're perfect, as if their processes are perfect. When I see a sanctimonious intrusion into academia, it reminds me about how every parent thinks they can be a teacher, how every parent thinks that they understand education. There are reasons why we have experts in different disciplines. And my biggest disdain at the moment is for the lack of respect that our legislators seem to be demonstrating toward academia. If you live in a glass house, you don't throw stones. And I can't think of a more fragile glass house than our legislators.
So once you have been given tenure, it's very, very difficult to lose it.
Yes.
Okay. Now, the hope is that once given tenure, also the level of motivation that got you to that position will be retained, and you will continue to perform at the same level that you had been performing in the years up to receiving tenure.
Yes. Which is an unreasonable hope, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Okay. So let's start with that first. Right? And so if that is the premise, then it's doomed to fail. Right? If we're not going to apply humanistic values to tenure, then of course we can get rid of it in a legislative act. Of course we can undermine it easily. That is not how it should be done or even questioned. First of all, as I told you, making an analogy to sports is inappropriate. We're talking about making an analogy to anything is inappropriate because
there's nothing that is comparable in anything else that I can think of.
Not only that, the work that is being done is disparate even within academia. Let's take an English teacher, a biostatistic professor, a immunology researcher, and a physics teacher.
We had three sides. Put a musician in there.
Okay, and a musician. Good, thank you. The arts.
Yeah.
Right? And let's say that they all get tenure. Now, the scientific faculty usually get tenure because they've proven their worth by getting state and federal grants to fund their projects, and they have patents as a result of their work when they were in their 20s, 30s, 40s. Now, if that suddenly stops, should they lose tenure? Are they no longer valuable as sage advisors to younger professors in the same area, as intellectual stimulants for students? Should they lose tenure because they're no longer working the way they were in their formative years? This is where we get inhuman to me. We don't look at the intrinsic value of the contribution. We're too busy comparing it to what we think is objective. Well, Babe Ruth stopped hitting a lot of home runs as he got older too. That doesn't mean he couldn't teach somebody how to hit a home run.
Correct. So there's a certain amount of importance of keeping sage individuals around as a resource, even if they're not as productive in the fashion that they were in the past, they could still be productive in other fashions.
Correct.
And I don't know how faculty members are rewarded financially, and we don't want to get into that into too great a depth, but there is a benefit to keeping tenure people around because of what they bring to the table long term.
Correct.
So let's play the devil's advocate and say they're not good mentors. They're not good teachers of others. And now they are just riding the rail because they have tenure.
And that's where the weakness of our tenure system is.
Right.
Because it's a collegially based system.
Right.
You have to you almost have to commit a crime before somebody's going to kick you out. And in today's day and time, I'm not sure we know what a crime is.
Yeah, there's another discussion. You're right. It is it's an interesting dilemma. I mean, we reward people for the work that they've done, and we continue to reward people as long as they are contributing. And I won't use a sports analogy because there's a perfect one that I can use, except to say that at some point in time, when the contributions wane, well, they still get their office.
Yeah, and at some point, biology wins, right? This reminds me of another discussion I've had about the role of seniors in our society
Now that I'm one,
and how we value or don't value them, how we use or don't use them. The presidential election is a very good example. No, I don't care what you think about Biden as far as this discussion is concerned, but his biggest handicap right now is his age, not his experience, his age. If it hadn't been for his experience, I'm not sure we could have turned things around as quickly as we did in the first 2 years of his presidency. I'm not sure that the chaos that was created by his predecessor would have quieted as soon as it was if it weren't for his experience.
we call that sage and wise, and it comes with gray hair.
And it's something that you aren't rewarded for.
No.
Think about it. It's hard to say you did a great job because I stopped having nightmares.
Yeah, that's not
I thank you so much for letting me sleep at night. Thank you so much for letting me know that you're not going to have a knee-jerk reaction tomorrow and start World War III.
So how do we continue to recognize the work that was done without penalizing people for biology?
Well, that's the challenge, right? And so that's why I'm in favor of the rolling contracts. At some point, I should recognize that my contribution to society is dwindling. It's going to be dwindling. And why should I expect a 5-year rolling contract when I start approaching the age where I might not even be here in 5 years? On the other hand, why should you jettison me just because I turned 65?
Is there a university or global situation that says, no matter what your age is, or excuse me, no matter what your status is at 65, even if you have tenure, there's a forced retirement? Is that, and because I've seen a lot of teachers or faculty that are over than 65 that are continuing in the faculty realm. So is there anything in the universities that have age mandated retirement?
There are some states that have that.
So whether you've got status or not, whether you're a contributor or not, you reach a certain age and stage, and they put you out to pasture.
And and they force you to retire. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Now, I don't know how common that is now.
Yes,
I'm not a retirement expert. As a matter of fact, I'm a retirement baby.
So, because this is kind of a long-term process within the world of academics, the mandate or the concept of tenure is controlled at the university level, but not at the governmental level. So every university gets to define this, or is this a state legislative definition? I mean, where does this come from? Because if we're going to look at change, would every university have to define their own changes?
Yes.
Wow.
And that's the beauty of academia.
Right.
I mean, it's the diversity of the approach that actually creates the possibility for a eureka moment. You asked a very deep question unknowingly by suggesting that process be regulated by government. I said suggest, okay? And my point is that that's the last thing we need.
Well, I asked you because I wasn't aware that it wasn't regulated by government.
Yes. Well, I mean, retirement is regulated, all that kind of stuff, but the actual enaction of tenure isn't, except that in South Carolina, they just repealed tenure for new professors.
The education system did, or the state legislature did?
The state legislature.
So how can they do that if they really don't have oversight on that?
Well, I didn't say they do have oversight. They've never bothered to deal with this before.
So if a university wanted to change its approach to tenure and gut the way it's been for hundreds of years and create their own system of rolling contracts, it would take a vote of the faculty to make that change, or could that be done at the administrative level?
Depends on the college, depends on the university. I am sure that the faculty would be involved in some way. How much they would be involved, how effective they might be in protecting it, if they didn't like it, that all depends on the university.
So in the same way that it's unlikely for the Senate or Congress to vote term limits because essentially they're putting themselves out of business in many ways, this would be a challenge to institute in many universities because there's a benefit to the university in many ways to have tenure faculty members.
I'm not sure I would have said it that way, but I can't. You're not incorrect.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, I don't remember. I think we did it at a statewide ballot or initiative in California that we did away with. We put term limits in Sacramento. I think that's how that. I don't think the legislature in Sacramento voted for it, but I don't recall how that process went. You've been around as long as I have. Do you remember how what
process went?
The process of we put term limits up in Sacramento. It must have been done by a statewide vote.
I think that was done by referendum.
Okay. That's what I was getting at. It would take that type of referendum to get it done because the legislative branches wouldn't do that on their own.
Well, actually, there are a number of ways it could happen. The most likely way would be that a university goes through fiscal exigencies.
Mm-hmm.
And as a result, the administration would end up taking administrative action to reduce the liability. Oh, I'm sorry. It wasn't South Carolina, it was Texas. And right now it has just passed the Texas Senate, and it only applies to new faculty hires. And see, and that's another way to do it, right? You don't mess with the people who are union members.
Right.
You just say, if you want a job, you can't become a union member.
So there is the potential that if a university, whether it's a new university or an existing university, would have put in a place that said something like, okay, those of you who are here, you have a grandfather clause, you could be considered for tenure. If you've already got it, you get to keep it. But all new hires, we will not be offering tenure as an option.
Right. I really don't want to state my position on that. What is threatening to me is that it is coming from the legislature.
Right. Which goes back to your comment about people in glass houses.
Yes. Well, more importantly, it's coming from units that have not taken the time to investigate, who did not bring in academicians, who did not bring in even presidents of their own institutions to discuss the impact of this. Did not involve the faculty who are going to be involved. I'm reticent to support any kind of move like that. Takes an authoritarian approach as opposed to a shared governance approach, a democratic approach. So this is just like the judge in Texas saying that appeal that has been proven to be as safe as Tylenol over 40 years should be withdrawn because he's convinced the FDA doesn't know what they're doing.
We have a difficult enough time finding good teachers, good academicians. Would eliminating tenure track opportunities make it even harder?
It won't make it any more attractive. So that's the best way you can put that, right? And if you care about having good teachers for your children, K through 12 or college, then you should care about the environment that they have to teach in. But most of us don't think that far. We're too busy participating in the culture wars and trying to decide which side of the culture war we are on. And then our actions are dictated by that.
Now, there is no equivalent to tenure in elementary and secondary schools, is there?
I don't think so. In some schools there are, but it's not prominent, no.
Interesting stuff. Good conversation. I think there was some good stuff in there that helped me have a better understanding, but
After that discussion, where do you stand? I'm sorry, before the discussion, where did you stand? And now after the discussion, where do you stand?
I have a much greater appreciation of what it takes to become tenured. And I have a continued concern about how do we continue to recognize people for the work that they did when they stopped doing the work. I think we have to find ways to recognize the work that they've done and carefully and professionally guide them to the door so that there can be some change within an environment. So my feelings are is that tenure is a good thing, but there needs to be some limits to it so that, you know, it doesn't become like a Supreme Court justice, for lack of a better way to put it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Can I twist that for just a second?
Go ahead.
What do you think of term limits for Supreme Court justices? United States Supreme Court.
I know. First of all, you should know that I think term limits is a very crude instrument to use.
Okay.
I look at just California, for instance. Some of the problems I think we have in the legislature is because we don't have enough seasoned people in the legislature who truly understand the complexity of the problems they're attacking. And I think it takes a while for that to happen.
You got to play in the minor leagues before you can get to the big leagues.
I love the way you made that jump, because that's exactly what I was about to introduce. And that was, I think that we have come up with a great big sword that truncates legislative participation or participation in the legislature, when we should be looking at the entire governance process. There is no minor league in our system. There is only the major league, and rookies and veterans alike get to run for office. I think California would benefit. Let's say we decide to keep term limits the way they are. Then there needs to be a minor league system that feeds into that. There needs to be a minor league area that actually impacts legislative considerations, that does the studies, that does the work, and then the veterans of that league become eligible for running for office. Now, what that minor league is, I don't know. But I really believe that city involvement would be the qualification for someone being able to run. Now, I say that with a grain of salt because of the diversity of people who run. But the problem is when you have a bunch of rookies sitting around the table trying to figure out the tax implications of a gas tax or the homeless, and even though somebody might be well-heeled in one area, once they get into the legislature, they have to deal with all of them.
Well, in many ways, the city councils and boards of supervisors in a big city like a Los Angeles or a San Francisco or a Sacramento might be a good minor league.
Yeah, well, I think the real issue here is how integrated is our government with the agencies that deal with the problems.
Right.
You know, we have a lot of nonprofits that are disconnected with the government effectors that are going to actually try to solve the problem. The best grants that I've ever worked on were grants that came out of an institution's need, and then a representative of that institution went to the legislator and said, we need money to do this. We think this is important. And they convinced the legislator that this was important. And then the legislator wrote the grant to achieve the need, and it worked seamlessly. And then the legislature convinced the rest of the legislature that this was important. Instead of responding to a homeless issue and throwing money at it and then say, y'all apply for a grant. And I think that's the problem I have with term limits. Everybody sees term limits as the end-all solution.
What I look at is sometimes we just need some new ideas. And term limits to me is a way to get some new ideas. It may not be the best way to do so, because it actually may slow down the process in many ways, because, as you noted, there's a learning curve that slows down the process. So the ability to ramp up into a skilled position, it's almost like you go through in a professorship standpoint.
Yeah.
Associate, whatever it is, whatever the terms are. It's like being an associate in a veterinary hospital. Then you get more skills. Then maybe you become an owner, but eventually you need to have somebody else come in and a voice with new ideas to help your practice down the road. So I think my thoughts on term limits came from the fact that when we know that we're going to constantly be doing something, we don't work as hard. But I think that the goal is to try to make change and respond to things that are going on. And I think sometimes having some new blood goes there. But that's what elections are for too, aren't they?
That's right. That's the other thing. I think that we came up with term limits because of the voter disenchantment essentially castrated our ability to withdraw ineffective legislators. And now term limits, again, is the big sword. We still have voter disenchantment. And anybody who's able to maintain any kind of campaign fund can stay in, and they can spend half their time campaigning. Well, except for maybe Santos. But I think we come up with these shortcuts. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that term limits are bad. I just think they're inappropriately used. I'd like to see some sub-legislatures at a sub-state level. Maybe we could have regional legislatures. I mean, we have city and town. Then maybe we should have a regional legislatures.
I think it's a great discussion, and I think this entire discussion was wonderful and very eye-opening for me and for all of our listeners out there, and especially if we have some young students or people who are recently out of school. I think having a better understanding of the process that faculty members go through and understanding that where this whole history came from, to me that was eye-opening, and I think it gave me a much better appreciation of what the university settings are like. Maybe the answer isn't always the quick fix, but I think talking about some fixes, as we've talked about in terms of regional options, I think that could give all of us in the world just some choices for the future, because a lot of these things, as you noted at the very beginning, talking about tenure, have been going on for centuries, and the world around us is changing and different than it was. I'm not saying change for change's sake. I am saying change because the world around us continues to change. So great conversation. Thank you, Phil.
Well, I enjoyed it too. And thank you, Nationwide, for supporting us and supporting this broadcast. Peter, I enjoyed it. I look forward to our next conversation.
Thank you, Phil. Until next time, thanks to you and thanks to all of our listeners, and thank you to Nationwide.
Thank you for joining us for another courageous conversation. Be sure to follow us and check back next week for more.